Hello and welcome back to Robot Republic. I'm Josh, and this week on ChatBot we are joined by the lovely Rachel, who is developing a really awesome indie game called WitchHazel Woods. Hello, Rachel.
Hi there. Happy to be here.
Brilliant, lovely to have you as well. Honestly, I'm really excited about this game. So WitchHazel Woods is when I watched the trailers and I watched all the promo stuff prepping for this interview, it struck me as, and the one thing kind of came to mind when I was watching it through, it was like watching a kind of like beautiful pixel art Tim Burton inspired game. Um, with this, what was your kind of inspiration for this? Was it the kind of like, was there a particular kind of like film director or kind of like stylization of film, or was it kind of old school point and click RPGs, or is it something a little bit more recent like Nine was kind of what were your main points of inspiration for this game? Because it does look really cool.
Thank you so much for that. Yeah, for inspiration, it's funny. It's kind of hard to actually pinpoint anything in particular. I have been a big fan of Tim Burton movies, so maybe there was some kind of subconscious inspiration there now that you mentioned that. But yeah, in terms of games, I haven't actually played Night in the Woods. I should do that. So yeah, it's hard to identify a particular game or anything that inspired it. More than anything, I would say it was actually inspired by like this local park near me that we started going to like early in the pandemic. This park is like it's these days it's kind of just like a nature preserve with like walking trails, but like in the past, in like the early 1900s, there was a school on this land, and there's still like abandoned buildings left over from the school that are kind of being reclaimed by nature, and they're all covered in graffiti and stuff. So walking around this place, it's just kind of like haunted feeling. And there's just like this interesting kind of juxtaposition of like nature with like the human elements. And that vibe was just like really interesting to me. So before I had anything else, like any characters or mechanics or plots, I was just like, I want to make a game with like this sort of aesthetic. And that was kind of the jumping off point, weirdly enough.
Oh, that's so cool. And this is just somewhere that you found when you were kind of trying to get in, like most of us were during the early days of the pandemic, just trying to get our little bit of time outside with some fresh air that wasn't necessarily our back gardens.
Yeah, these were those early days when we didn't even know yet, like, whether it was okay to, like, walk by somebody else outside. So we were kind of nervous to go to some of our usual spots that were, like, more heavily trafficked. And we just, like, found this weird spot to walk around. And it turned out to be just this really cool park that inspired my game. So, yeah.
That's so cool. That is really cool, actually. Just finding something in the natural world and then from that being like, I'm going to make a game with this sort of aesthetic and this sort of feel. That is so cool. Um,
Thanks.
so obviously, kind of the game's narrative. I'm not going to kind of go into too much depth because I think people will kind of get the gist from the video that's playing in the little box, which will be either there, I think there, or down there, or somewhere. Um, but kind of, where did the idea of having your protagonist kind of helping these array of woodland creatures come from? Because there's such a huge variety of different kind of creatures and stuff um, in the game that the protagonist is able to interact with. Was that kind of as a result of this jumping off point? You kind of looked at this reclaimed by the natural world sort of thing, and you thought there are going to be all these creatures there, and you're going to want this protagonist who's going to, um, really kind of like work with these kind of creatures to kind of help them, and in return they might help you, but in return they might not help you.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, so kind of
Yeah. Yeah, those early days when kind of all I really had was that aesthetic, and I was starting to kind of have some ideas about some characters. Um, yeah, I definitely wanted like kind of a surreal and spooky, but not full on like horror vibe. And so I was starting to come up with some of these like slightly unnerving characters that I wanted to include. But I was like struggling to decide on the actual game mechanics. Like that was actually one of the last things I came up with in the process. So I was trying to decide how exactly the game was going to work. And since it's my first game ever, I was also like reading advice for first time game devs. And the number one thing that I kept hearing was like, just build something kind of small and simple for your first game. And so I thought that just like focusing on the narrative and on interacting with characters would help me kind of keep the scope relatively like manageable. So like most of the gameplay happens through dialogue selections, which I didn't have to, because it's not like a platformer or anything. I didn't have to program any physics for the most part, so that helped keep things simple. In hindsight, though, there's like 24 characters in the game, so that was like a huge amount of art and animation work. So
God,
I could have kept things simpler for sure, but yeah.
I mean, you say that, but I think part of the charm of this game, from kind of like what we've seen and kind of like bits that we've looked at and stuff, is from these characters, and this will kind of, like I said, we'll come on to the narrative a bit more in a bit, but kind of like the individual characters stuff, they're really unique, and you've got this really interesting blend of kind of these more generic or kind of like normal animal creatures, and then you've got these slightly more, I don't want to use the word sinister, but these more kind of like, creepy, Nightmare Before Christmas Burton kind of film-esque vibes to them, which is really, really cool. Because obviously we've touched on the kind of inspiration for the game and stuff, kind of in terms of like the stylization and the aesthetic and whatnot, the kind of hand painted-y, pixel arty kind of vibe. Is that something that when you were kind of thinking about, people saying, start relatively small with your kind of like first game and stuff, is that something that you kind of had in mind in terms of like, if I'm gonna do something small scale, I'm gonna do this kind of like this very stylistically and aesthetically kind of focused game with a really strong narrative? Was that kind of where you kind of moved on to next, when you kind of thought about these protagonists and a kind of like basic narrative?
Yeah, for sure. The art was definitely influenced by, in part, like you said, I wanted a big portion of the appeal of the game for it to be just like a pretty game and kind of immersive feeling. And then, yeah, I'm new to pixel art. I settled on pixel art in part because I'm also new to animation. So let's back up a little bit. I've been doing digital art for a number of years, but mostly digital painting, not animation. That's new to me. So a big priority was I wanted to find a style that I felt like I would be able to like complete the animation work for without it becoming kind of unmanageable. So I really hate like doing line art. So like inking a bunch of frames of animation just sounded like it would be too much. And also like my kind of normal style that's like painterly and shaded, fully shaded and everything, that also didn't seem quite manageable. So I explored pixel art, which I had never really done before. And I found that it worked well for me in part because it meshed well with doing procedural generation.
Yeah.
Most of the trees in the game are procedurally generated, and I explored that early on because I was intimidated by the prospect of making a game that takes place in the woods and having to draw like 100 trees
yeah.
or, yeah. I mean, you can draw fewer and then reuse them, but I also didn't want it to like look repetitive.
Yeah.
So I found pretty early on that I was able to procedurally generate some pixel art trees that I thought looked pretty convincing. And so from there, I started exploring. Obviously, the characters are hand drawn. So drawing and animating in pixel art. And I settled on, I think, kind of a slightly unusual pixel art style. I feel like most pixel art games are kind of at a lower resolution with less detail, and that can be really fun and like retro and cozy. But it didn't quite fit the vibe I was going for, so I went for this kind of higher resolution pixel art style that I'm pretty happy with.
Oh, it looks amazing, actually.
Thank you.
Like you say, kind of, it's something that's a little bit fresher in the market. Like it will. When I was kind of looking at this, and I was kind of thinking about other pixel art games, because it's like you say, it's that the resolution's a little bit higher than the kind of 8-bit pixel art that anyone who is old enough to remember the Game Boy and the Game Boy Color will be aware of. It's kind of that step up, and I think that it really does kind of help the whole game's aesthetic kind of stand out a bit more. So you've got this really beautiful, slightly creepy, cool world with these kind of higher resolution pixels, and that's one of the things that jumped out to me actually was the kind of art style and the aesthetics of the game was really cool. And procedural generation with the landscapes. Oh my god, that is so cool. So obviously, like a lot of people hear procedural generation, and it's a lot of gamers hear that and they just go, "Oh, it's another roguelike." But actually, to use that to kind of help create environments is really cool. Actually, like just purely environmental use of procedural generation is just that's really awesome.
Thanks so much. Yeah, it is a little different from what you typically think of when you hear procedural generation in a game because it's not like there are no like levels that are fully procedurally generated or anything like that. It's really just to draw the trees in the background, and even then, like it is deterministic. Like each player will see all of the same trees. I can get into a little more detail on how that works later, but yeah, it was really mostly just to help alleviate the burden of drawing that many trees by hand.
Oh, absolutely. Otherwise, I was going to say that the timescale to just draw that many trees would have just madness. That's so cool. Kind of shuffling on to kind of like looking at the kind of the narrative and whatnot. Kind of, we've touched upon this a little bit already, but kind of want to take a little bit of a closer look at it now. When you were developing the narrative, kind of when you were working on it and developing it stuff, did you kind of, so obviously you went out, kind of like found this really awesome, kind of almost kind of spooky-esque park and stuff, and then from that was your jumping off point, and you started coming up with these characters and interactions and whatnot. When you were developing the narrative, did these ideas kind of just like build one onto the next, or was it kind of like you came up with the kind of like the kind of core narrative and then built around that kind of in terms of when you were developing it? Was it like, right, I know what the course of the game is going to be, and then once you had that kind of set out, you were like, right, I'm now going to build these little bits onto it, and I'm going to add details, or was it kind of like I'm going to have this bit, and then I'm going to move on, there'll be this bit, and then this bit, and then this bit, and this bit?
Yeah, I mostly tackled it all at once, and it was one of the earliest things I undertook. So once I had kind of decided that the main thrust of the game is you're meeting and basically trading with all these different characters, and you're helping them out, and then they're kind of helping you in return. I then had to figure out how to kind of make a logical progression through the whole game. So like, one character gives you a certain item, and then another character receives that item from you later on. And I wanted every character to have kind of a distinct personality and for their whole like predicament that they're in to kind of fit with their character. And I wanted the solution to all of their different problems to like make sense and seem logical. And this was tricky because like for every item in the game, there must be a character who would reasonably give you that item and another character who would want to receive that item. So when I'm in this kind of early stage and I have just like a few characters in mind that I definitely want, but I don't yet have like a complete or hard list of all the characters, that gave me some flexibility here to design the narrative. So I started by just kind of brainstorming like what sort of creatures kind of fit the vibe of the game, and what kinds of problems would those creatures have, and how can you help them? So like an example of this is my praying mantis character is having a crisis of faith, because I just thought that was kind of a pun that I wanted to work in there. So then I had to kind of think through like what kind of objects would each creature like have on their person that they could give you as a reward for helping them, and string them together to form the complete narrative. So I did this early on so that I could come up with the complete list of all the characters that were going to be in the game, and just how the whole game would play out. Oh, and I wanted to build in some branching, so not every playthrough is identical. So that was a little bit of extra effort, but I think definitely worth it. So yeah, it took me a few iterations of brainstorming, but I did do this early on before I got deep into the development.
That's awesome. I'm kind of thinking about the narrative. obviously when you kind of we spoke about again we touched on this a little bit earlier, but kind of you went to this kind of when you were going to this place and you kind of saw this kind of like weird, creepy, spooky, almost haunted vibe. Um, is that kind of where some of the inspiration came for these kind of more supernatural creatures? Like there are some ghosts in there. There's a really cool skeleton deer. Was that kind of inspired by that kind of like looking at this building that was being reclaimed by nature and kind of looked a little bit spooky, a little bit haunted?
Yeah, absolutely. So, one of the things that's like kind of sad and morbid about this park is there's a graveyard in it, and it's a really weird little graveyard where the graves are marked with these tiny little stones that have numbers on them. They don't even have names on them. So I was like shocked the first time that I saw this graveyard. It's just like so strange and sad, and that's kind of what got me thinking about this character of a ghost
Yeah.
who, he's kind of been abandoned in death, and he's having a very lonely afterlife. So I came up with that ghost character pretty early on. And even though he's like the main antagonist of the game, he's not really a bad guy. He's just, he's someone who needs some help and companionship. And he's also not all that scary, even though he's a ghost. He's just a guy who's dead,
He's a grumpy guy who's just, he's bored of being alone, basically. He just wants a friend.
Yeah, exactly.
That's kind of adorable and also a little bit creepy, and I can't wait to meet him. Next question is about kind of like, we've kind of touched upon the kind of like chunks of the development and stuff of this kind of whilst you've been developing this kind of in terms of both design and programming, because obviously like, different people, there are different parts of kind of like game making that, struggle. Some people find the design really simple, other people find programming really simple, and some people develop games and they kind of sit there going, oh god, I'm going to have to watch another 20 hours of YouTube videos on how to draw things and 50 hours on how to do basic programming in Unity. When you were developing WitchHazel Woods, kind of what have been some of your biggest challenges, both from a design and a program perspective, and kind of how have you kind of overcome those and stuff, really?
Yeah, that's an interesting point about some parts being harder for some people than others. I am a developer professionally, so I would say the programming parts have been the easier parts. I also have done digital art as a hobby for quite a number of years, but like I said before, not animation and not pixel art. So I would say the art has been challenging. Learning to do animation has been challenging and just like very time consuming in general. Like, I've been doing more of the programming work recently because I finished most of the art a while back. But early on, I expected the split of the work to be like 50-50 programming and art, and it was more like 70-30 art over programming. But I can get into some of the programming challenges too, because I think some of this is kind of interesting. Let me know if I'm getting too into the weeds or anything.
This is why we do these, for people to talk about kind of these challenges and stuff, because it's really interesting to actually learn about these things.
Great. Well, I love the opportunity to nerd out about the stuff I've built. So.
Love it. Absolutely love it.
Yeah. Okay. So the procedural generation that I mentioned earlier, that I'm pretty proud of the system I built for that. So like I was saying, it is deterministic, like what you will see in the game. All players are going to see the same thing, basically. And the reason for that is because it's hard to develop an algorithm for procedurally generating a tree where like every single tree that it outputs looks good. So I built this system where even though the tree is procedurally generated, I am hand selecting like the location of each tree and also the kind of the input into the function. So the seed for the random number generator, I also hand select. So what that means is if there's a tree that looks bad, I can like make sure that that doesn't actually end up in the game. So that was fun to build. Another thing that was kind of technically challenging but was like really important to the aesthetics of the game is the parallax scrolling. So that's where that's the effect where the more distant objects kind of move by slower than nearby objects
Yeah.
as you're moving side to side. And so I built that by kind of like drawing each layer of scenery on, it's called a surface. I'm using Game Maker Studio 2, that's what they call it. And so you can kind of just like draw onto that surface and then drag it around, and so they're being dragged around at different speeds to create that effect. But because it's just kind of a unique thing, it's a lot of custom code, and I'm not getting to use some of the nice out-of-the-box stuff that Game Maker gives you for camera. So that was a challenge. And then just as a solo dev, another major challenge is just like the volume of work. Like, if you want to make a game, and particularly like if you want to do it alone, and even more so if it's just something you're doing in your free time and it's not your full-time job, as it is free. It's not my full-time job, to be clear. It's just a long-term project. So I think by the time I release, I will have been working on WitchHazel Woods for about 2 years, and I've just kind of developed this zen around it. Like, it takes however long it takes. I work steadily, but not so hard that I burn myself out, because I think that's really important. But yeah, it has been really fun. So
Awesome. And it's a proper passion project. It's not one of those, I've quit my job and I now need to develop a game and I need to get it out there, otherwise I'm not going to be able to pay my bills. This is something I want to do. It's something that I've been inspired to do, and I'm going to work on this, and I want to make this, and I want to give it to the world to kind of appreciate and watch stuff. And that is so cool. And
thanks.
kind of game engines at times are not the most friendliest of things. That out of the box coding is so good, but when you have to do custom code, it sometimes becomes some of the most laborious stuff in the world. You just like, why does this not work? Why is this not working? This should work. So I completely understand how time consuming it is to kind of like have to sit there and like create your own custom coding and stuff. But that is so cool. And the fact that you kind of used not only procedural generation, but you kind of created your own custom code to kind of create these kind of parallax movements within layers and stuff is, that's so cool.
Thanks. Yeah, you can kind of see my mood swings on Twitter. I'll be posting and I'll be like, making a game is the funnest thing in the world. Everyone should make a game. And then 2 weeks later, I'll be like, never make a game. It will ruin your life. But for the most part.
I have liked some of those tweets. I've been liking more of the don't do it. It's so time consuming and it's so rage inducing. I'm like, yes, no, it really is. Let's just not bother. But it is.
Those are honestly, yeah. Those are fleeting. I hate it for like 2 minutes and then I'm back to loving it again.
Yeah. I think that's the thing, isn't it? Especially when it's a passion project. It's just like, this is so infuriating and I'm so raging, and then 5 minutes later, you're like, oh, it works. Best thing ever.
Yep, absolutely.
Oh, that's amazing. Last question then. What comes next? Because obviously I'm dying to play this. No pressure, obviously. It's ready when it's ready. But this is such a cool game. Kind of what is coming next for you and for the kind of WitchHazel Woods development?
Yeah, so I expect to have the Steam page up for wish listing very soon. I've been working on it, but there's kind of this review process, so it takes a little bit of time. Certainly, I will let everyone know on Twitter once that wish list page is up. And then, yeah, I mean, the game isn't done. I'm still working on it steadily. I'm probably going to be working on it all weekend this weekend. We're definitely in the home stretch, but there's still work to do. So I'm hoping to release on Steam within a few months, probably Q1 or Q2 of 2022. And yeah, and then it's going to be the marketing part, which I hear from other indie devs is a very challenging part of the process. So we'll see how that goes.
I mean, we will, at Robot Republic, we're going to be retweeting about this. Obviously, hopefully, our discussion today will help as well, kind of raise awareness of it among our small but growing community. And yeah, cannot wait for this to be released, and we would definitely love to have you back when the game is released to talk about the kind of the final hurdles and the home straight and all those sporty based puns that people say, and I don't quite understand because I'm not a sporty based person.
Same. Awesome. Yeah, no, that would be fantastic.
Oh, that's amazing. Oh, well, Rachel, thank you so much for joining us on this chatbot. It has been wonderful. And yeah, if you are watching this video, please do go and look up WitchHazel Woods. Kind of do some research. Go and follow Rachel on Twitter. Her Twitter handle will be under her box on the video, and has been actually for this entire thing. So go and look Rachel up on Twitter so you get live updates on this really cool game that's coming out. Hopefully within the next 6 to 8 months, maybe we'll see. Fingers crossed. And also, please do hit that like button and hit that subscribe button and tickle that little bell icon so you get notified for all of our awesome content. We tend to drop one of these wonderful chatbots with these lovely indie devs that give up their time to talk to me for some reason, kind of every other week. So please do like, subscribe, and hit that bell icon for notifications. Last thing from me, Rachel, thank you so much for joining us. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Oh, thank you. I really appreciate your interest and for, giving me this opportunity to nerd out about it a little bit. So
Absolute pleasure.
lovely.
It's been amazing. Oh, right. Well, thank you very much, Rachel, and we will see you people next time. Bye, guys.